Um, let me make a sort of disclaimer, if you will, and please tell me whether I'm clearly audible. This morning when I was driving to work and preparing for this presentation, I had a particular presentation in mind. And as I contemplated how I was going to go about this presentation, I quickly changed tack and developed another presentation when I got to work this morning. Because my brief is twofold. The one is to focus on constitutional values and principles governing public administration as per Section 185. But I also need to link that, and you will see later why I'm doing this in the presentation, to professionalization. And in particular, the National Framework Document on the Professionalization of the Public Sector that was adopted by Cabinet in October 2022. And so I decided to change the presentation and start with professionalization, just understanding the context of professionalization and why we find ourselves in the position that we find ourselves in as a country. Some of the things that I may say may be construed as somewhat controversial in certain spaces, but it is important that we reflect on these things and we engage on them. I must also say to you that as part of the Public Service Commission, in terms of the professionalization framework, I'm going to dub it as the professionalization framework. The draft document was gazetted in 2020, December 2020. And there were calls to make submissions to the draft document. The Public Service Commission did that. And there was a fairly lengthy engagement process with a number of stakeholders around the draft document. That subsequently resulted in a ministerial task team that was established in memory serves in 2022, I think. The Public Service Commission was also part of the ministerial task team where the current document on professionalization then was adopted by Cabinet. But we often talk about professionalization, and I think I would like this process, this engagement, this discussion, this webinar to be interactive and engaging. So if people have questions, please do not hesitate to ask questions. But we often talk within the public service, in the public sector, about professionalization. And we do know that professionalization has become a bit of a buzzword. We do know that professionalization is important, but what to professionalize and how to professionalize becomes the key issue. What is the problem within the public service or public sector? And you will see that I speak about public service and public sector at the same time, because when we drafted the draft document on professionalization was gazetted, it was the professionalization of the public service. But subsequent to the ministerial task team and further discussions and engagements that took place, the document now speaks to the professionalization of the entire public sector, which includes then provincial government, national government, local government, as well as state-owned entities. So it's the entire public sector that one is talking about in terms of professionalization. When President Ramaphosa appeared before the Zondo Commission in 2021, he made this particular argument about the priority of building a capable and ethical and professional public service. And to quote the president, professionalization of the civil service, as he puts it, would seek to address the problems that we have had. We do have some people in our civil service who are ill qualified, who are not that fit for purpose, who do not have those qualifications that are necessary. Now we want to professionalize the civil service, and that will happen in a variety of ways. And we are not talking about chucking people out. We are talking about capacitating those people, having them properly trained. The South African public service has been crying out for professionalization for nearly 3 decades. But if you recall, one of the core reasons why the president appeared before the Zondo Commission was to clarify the ANC's policy on cadre deployment. And to answer in specific terms how this may have impacted on the deficiencies in the public sector. And in addition, given the Zondo Commission, whether it contributed to state capture. And if you recall further that the president was a bit reluctant to go in depth, and hence the, I think it was just recently, I was at the SCA, well, the ANC appealed to the SCA and that was dismissed. That's one of the reasons why the Democratic Alliance has taken and requested documents around cadre deployment, but be that as it may. So what the president said before the Zondo Commission was, cadre deployment is something that is not unusual, and we'll speak about that a little bit later, but there were unintended consequences to cadre deployment. Because it created factionalism, it subverted the interests of careerism within the public sector and the public service, and it was used and abused for particular sectional interests. And that was in 2021. And I want to then fast forward to 2022. So the whole aspect of professionalization is linked to Chapter 13 of the National Development Plan. And the National Development Plan, Chapter 13, speaks about specifically about building a capable, ethical, and professional public service. And so the national framework towards the professionalization of the public sector is really the articulation and the policy framework, if you will, to Chapter 13 of the National Development Plan. And so there's quite a buzz around the framework. And we'll speak a little bit about it a little bit later. And that we must move towards this systematic process of meritocracy in our public sector, move towards a specific process of developing and creating a cadre of ideal public servants, reviewing induction and the entry requirements, trying to also create a single public service, and we will get to that a little bit later as well. Reviewing policies, reviewing performance management development system, and also trying to resolve the intricacies and the complications around the political administrative interface. And so there's this whole buzzword, I hope that there is, you guys can tell me, around the professionalization of the public service. That was in October 22. In July 2023, the Secretary General of the ANC, and I'll tell you why this becomes important, made a statement that the ANC will remove the Minister of Public Enterprises if there's no improvements at Transnet. But there's something inherently wrong with the statement, isn't it? Because the Secretary General does not have authority to make the statement, as cabinet ministers are appointed by the president and not the party. . And so therein lies somewhat the conundrum here around the confusion of the past 30 years in our democracy about this conflation between party and state. And in some respects, that speaks to the sort of dichotomy and contradiction between, or the contradiction which has led to some of the deficiencies within the public sector. It's become, to a certain extent, less professional and more fundamentally political. But there is no, or put it differently, it's unrealistic to argue, obviously, that there should be no political involvement. In any political system, there is, one way or another, some level of political involvement. And cadre deployment in any political system has a particular space. But when the challenge becomes, when that is that conflation between party and state, and that's when things start to become intensely undemocratic. That's where the space is blurred between the political administrative interface. But our lived reality is something that we cannot ignore in our country. Our lived reality is that there's acute maladministration. There is endemic corruption across the public sector. There's infrastructure collapse, and we all know this, and we all experience this as ordinary citizens in our country. There's pervasive service delivery failures. There are potholes. We're living in stage 6, load shedding at the moment. There are problems with water and sanitation. Our housing deficit is tremendously large. We have currently a disenfranchised citizenry. And we're also the most unequal country in the world, where the top 10% in our country owns about 80% of the wealth. And the bottom 60% accounts for 7% of the wealth in the world. And with all of that, you're sitting with a disempowered, disjointed, and demoralized public service corps. And generally, there is moral decay in our country, from the biggest to the smallest. And that is the lived reality. How do we get to this point in our history? Now, to get to this, to sort of understand this, and we can sort of postulate and come up with certain things that people are going to say, for example, corruption, maladministration, lack of enforcement of regulations. But to sort of contextualize this properly and to understand this, and this is where we're going to go to in terms of professionalization. For me, there are sort of two things predominantly. And so when we think about state capture, for example, we often say, state capture happened at some certain point, and before then it was okay. Right? It wasn't extensive, it wasn't that bad. What we don't realize that the cracks were there long before. The fissures were there long before. There was this gradual erosion of the past 30 years. And so one of the reasons that have been postulated is because when we started in 1994, we had this sort of mixed approach to public management and public sector reform. It was a time in the global world where sort of new public management became the verb, became fashionable, and there was this push for South Africa to adopt a new public management style or new public management approach. But we come from an apartheid era where, yes, it was racialized, and you had a variety of different administrations, but the apartheid public bureaucracy fundamentally had this sort of Weberian approach to it. It was sort of the traditional approach to public management. And of course, we needed to change that. But what new public management did that we adopted in sort of this sort of subversive way in a way, because you've got this sort of eclectic mixed approach, is that it weakened centralized control over the administrative apparatus of government. So there was a lot of decentralization and contractualization of service delivery, especially in the procurement and supply chain, right? But we have this mixed approach. We have this sort of traditional Weberian bureaucracy that exists within the public sector, coupled with a sort of new public management decentralization of control. In other words, what I'm trying to put forward here is that at the very beginning, we didn't understand and we didn't develop a public sector paradigm or ideology that was fit for what the country required. And over the past 30 years, what we've done is we just overlaid one policy over another, irrespective of the sort of its paradigmatic roots. That's the first point. The second point is around cadre deployment. You've got this sort of decentralized mixed approach system, but you also got cadre deployment that degenerated into sort of, as we said, sort of factionalized contestation, rent seeking. But importantly, it had an adverse effect on any effort to instill professional norms and capacity within the public service, which resulted in as well sort of this tension within the political administrative interface and lower down. And the effects of that can be felt in 5 acute ways, both in respect of new public management as well as factionalization or cadre deployment. One is that you had an acceleration of growth in middle and senior management. And that was sort of detrimental to frontline staff. And it was exponential, not only in the national and provincial sphere, but also at the local government sphere, where the public sector as a whole started to become top heavy. And that has impacted tremendously on the wage bill. Currently, our wage bill for the public service, which is just under 1.2 million public servants, is at 701 billion rand. That's our wage bill. For the public sector, our wage bill, which is now inclusive of local government and state-owned entities, is in excess of 900 billion rand. And that's huge. Which accounts for 14.8% of our country's GDP. So within the public service or public sector, you've got this growth of middle and senior managers to the detriment of frontline staff. So if you look at staff between 1 to 4 and 1 to 9, there was a significant reduction of about 10–15% of staff, of frontline staff. So that's the first sort of acute trend. The second one was deteriorating trends in public finance management. Which has resulted in wasteful and irregular expenditure. And even though we've tried to tighten regulations around supply chain and contracting, it didn't have the desired effect. If we look at it, we just think only of COVID-19 and what happened under COVID-19. You could see that deterioration. And then like I said before, there's political interference in senior management staff, and especially at the local government level. But we also experience in the course of time the increasing and inflated and fragmented government machinery that started to impact negatively on the form and the structure of government. So we need to start looking at the macro organization of government. In other words, just plainly put, do we have too many departments? And even if we don't have too many departments, how, through a corporate governance framework, how do they synergize the efforts? I was at an interesting land summit last week, and a number of those issues that people brought to the fore around housing, for example, around urban land reform, about gender-based violence, and this was all around Section 25, though, suggested to me that government departments are not speaking to each other at all. And the issue with Section 25, because it's very specific, Section 25, cannot necessarily be conflated with the access to adequate housing in terms of Section 26 of the Constitution. It's a housing issue, but it clearly then the Department of Human Settlements and the Department of Rural and Agricultural Rural Development and Land Reform are not speaking to one another. Neither is the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure speaking to the Department of Human Settlements. So you have this fragmented government machinery where we're not acting in unison. We've become compliance driven. We've become rules driven. So when we're sitting in our individual offices in our departments, for example, we quickly look at the APP and we're chasing the targets of the annual performance plan of what we need to do for the annual performance plan. But the annual performance plan and the chasing of the targets is not necessarily the issue, is it? Our issue is, and our reason for existence as the public service and as public servants, is delivery and development to the citizen. And so you see there as well, you've got this coming back to the mixed approaches. You have the sort of new public management and the traditional approach to the public service. We have become rules driven. We are incredibly rules driven. We're not innovative. We're not imaginative. And fundamentally, we don't seem to think about the citizen enough. And then the fifth issue is sort of high turnover of senior bureaucrats, which the Public Service Commission has done a number of studies around the high turnover of DGs and heads of department. And there's inconsistency around the tenure of heads of department and DGs. At some point, in some provinces, it's 3 years, in other provinces, 5 years. And so the professionalization framework is trying to correct that. And one of the proposals to the professionalization framework in terms of the tenure of senior bureaucrats is that directors general as well as heads of department need to have tenure of 10 years, and which is subject then to renewal and the revolving door and strict performance management requirements. But the high turnover of senior bureaucrats has the obvious multiplier effect of creating instability within the public service, demoralizes the public service, and what is the word that I'm looking for? Instability, insecurity within the public service core. So the professionalization framework it's a long document and quite a heavy document, right? But effectively, it focuses on 5 core pillars. recruitment and selection, induction and onboarding, planning and performance management, continuous professional development, and the career progression and succession planning. So ultimately, what it seeks to achieve, right, is to create, by creating sort of not rigidity within the system, but certainty within the system. So when you look at recruitment and selection, for example, sometimes panels don't even know what they're looking for themselves. And so we need to tighten the whole process of recruitment and selection. But there's no point in tightening recruitment and selection if we don't take the public servant, him or herself, through a proper induction and onboarding process. So why are you here? What is the objectives of government? And what does it mean to be a public servant? It's not a job. It's a career. It's a calling. And then planning and performance management is critical, just in terms of cooperative governance on the one hand, but performance management development system, which is a new public management creation, needs to be reviewed. It's not about performance bonuses. It's about seeing where we are in our current career, in our current job, and how we can improve in terms of the work that we're doing and the impact that we're delivering. But then there should be continuous professional development as well, right? So if you look at development states across the world, think about Japan, for example. Public servants in Japan are recruited from the top universities. And they go through an incredible induction process and a learning process, starting from the bottom and working all the way to the top. And so we also need to find ways in which there's this constant professional development. So you have your cadre of public servants that is able to not stay in that position for 20 years or 15 years, but progressively move up as they progress through the understanding and development of the public service. And so that links up with the fifth pillar of career progression, succession planning, etc. That this is sort of a systematic process. But I'm pretty certain that many public servants, and maybe some of you listening to me now and watching me now, thinking, but hey, Cameron, you know, we've heard this all before. You know, every time there's a policy and we think that things are going to change and they don't change. And you're absolutely correct. Which is why, if you look at the slide in front of you, it's developing an implementation plan to the professionalization framework. Requires, and that's why I started when I looked at sort of what are the problems within the public service, how did we get here? It's because the professionalization framework is a lot to do with public sector reform. And if we look at public sector reform, we need to think about the paradigm. What kind of change in paradigm are we required to achieve? And if so, then does the legislation and policy align with that paradigm change? Because we're not going to fix it if we actually know where we want to go. And that's a creation of autonomy embeddedness. In other words, we need to embed the system so that we're all exactly on the same page. And we need to legitimate the system. And it's not just a system that exists within the public sector, it's a system that exists within society, which I will deal with when we're looking at constitutional values and principles. And there's the creation of purposeful leadership. And we'll deal with that as well when we look at the constitutional values and principles, exactly what it's all about and what it actually means. With that paradigm change is the construction of a national goal that is accepted by all, and that is the national development plan that we have. But we often do not speak enough about the national development plan, and it certainly doesn't appear to be embraced by all. And then fifthly, and this is from sort of developmental states across the world, these 5 points. We need to develop proper capability in the bureaucracy. And it's not just capability of the person, but it's also institutional capability. So are our institutions capable to perform the service delivery objectives that it needs to perform? So, for example, if you look at the Department of Home Affairs, go to any Department of Home Affairs site, and you will find that there are hardly any people to serve you, officials to serve you. But if you look at the vacancy rate of the Department of Home Affairs, it's about 5%. And so the organization of the Department of Home Affairs currently, how it is structured, is not necessarily fit for purpose. So that's institutional capability, but there needs to be human resource capability, which is why the 5 pillars becomes important in terms of recruitment and selection, induction and onboarding, etc. Right? We need to develop people that are capable, and not just capable within the confines of the job that they're doing. They need to be capable within the public service. So we often sort of see ourselves as, okay, I'm Cameron Jacobs, I work for the Public Service Commission. And you see yourself in terms of that particular department that you're working in. But we form part of the public service. There's 1.2 million of us. And so we need to see our role not just only within the department, but we need to see a role within the public service as a whole. And so if we need to lend a hand or assistance elsewhere in the department, we're able to do that because we have the capability. And then there is this thinking within the professionalization framework itself around what we call the revolving door, to allow public servants to experience departments elsewhere for a period of time as part of their career progression, as part of their learning and development, because we're part of the public service. And capability is not only about qualifications. Capability is about the manner in which you perform your task, which includes your conduct, which includes your academic ability, and which includes your acumen. So then, professionalization framework, for me, deals with 3 fundamental things: paradigm change, character formation, and capability. So when you look at the entire document, and it can be quite abstract in certain aspects, certain parts, it can be quite technical, but fundamentally, this is what it's about. It's about paradigm change. In other words, in terms of public sector reform, in terms of public management, what paradigm are we seeking here? What is it that we want to achieve? We cannot have a mixed approach, a rules-based approach without any values. We cannot have a traditional bureaucracy that has the sort of chain of command as Weber developed it, and new public management. If we're going to decentralize, which we did, which we've done, but then you have to decentralize properly, then there needs to be proper delegation of authority. And then there's character formation. And character formation is again about who we are, why we are here. It's about our conduct. It's about how we interact and engage, not only with our colleagues, but with the citizenry out there. And we're looking for, in the public sector, we're looking for that ideal public servant, that he's going to do his or her job purely because it is their calling. And they're going to accord themselves in a manner that is befitting of a public servant. From the big things to the small things. Coming to work on time, leaving at the designated time, not taking 3-hour lunches, not being dismissive of citizens, doing your work to the best of your ability. In other words, being ethical fundamentally. And then the third aspect, and I've spoken about that, is capability, not just only human resource capability, but institutional capability. And so we need to look in terms of professionalization. Are the departments fit for purpose? How do we reorganize departments so that they actually can render the service that they need to? And because form follows function, what are the particular positions that are required, or posts that are required for that particular department? And what are the kind of individuals and what capabilities do they require? And that's the aspect of capability. So, why the constitutional values and principles? And I want to just go back here, character formation. We will not be able to achieve the professionalization of the public service without the actualization and internalization of our constitutional values and principles. These are just some cartoons that I put in here, just to give you an indication of where we are. So this one is particularly indicative. It says ethics in this country are going down the tubes. The father says to the son, well, I'm glad it concerns you. And the son says, well, I'm trying to buy a matric maths paper, see, but this crook tries to sell me a fake one. So why the constitutional values and principles, and why is it so important? Well, many of you don't necessarily know that the public service actually has the benefit of a value system that is prescriptive in Section 185. So in the Carmichael judgment, constitutional judgment, and I think, when was Carmichael? 2001. The Constitutional Court said this about our Constitution. It said, our Constitution is not merely a formal document regulating public power. It also embodies, like the German Constitution, an objective normative value system. And Section 185 is exactly that, together with the fundamental rights in the Bill of Rights and the preamble of our Constitution. That's our value system. It's a value system that we need to hold dear. And it's a value system that I said is prescriptive, it's peremptory. In other words, we must adhere to it. If you read Section 185, it says the public administration must adhere to the following values and principles. In other words, we got no choice. And it plays a fundamentally important role in respect of our conduct within the public administration and public service. So we have 9 values and principles: a high standard of professional ethics, efficient, economic, and effective use of resources. Public administration must be development orientated. Services must be provided fairly, impartially, and equitably, and without bias. People's needs must be responded to. We must be accountable. There must be transparency. There must be good human resource management, and public administration must be broadly representative. But we can't just see this as nine individual principles. We must see this as a value system. And part of that value system is 2 things, fundamentally: good governance and public servant leadership. So the values and principles direct us to good governance. And we often search in academic books and papers for definition of good governance. But in our context, in our constitutional context, good governance is simply the articulation and the adherence to the values and principles included in Section 185. The Constitution also speaks about, or the number of papers it speaks about, it's suggestive of transformative constitutionalism. In other words, our Constitution is a living document, especially when you look at the principle 3, public administration must be development oriented. It embraces transformative constitutionalism. It embraces the importance of improving the capabilities of everyone in society so that they in turn can contribute to the consolidation of our democracy. And so let me return to what I'm talking about development orientation. So often we look at efficient economic and use of effective resources, and we do this quantitatively very often. And so we do a comparative analysis between our achievement of the annual performance plan and the budget. So when we see that we achieved 100% of what we wanted to achieve in terms of the APP, and we spent 99% of our budget, we say, okay, that's efficient economic and effective use of resources. Okay. But development orientation is all about improving the capabilities of people. So what if, in the achievement of your targets in the APP, the impact of those targets are negligible? They didn't cause a change in society. In other words, you're not being development oriented because you're compliance driven. And if you're not development oriented, can you then say you were efficient and economic and effective in the use of your resources? And so you can't see them as individual. You have to see them as a value system. You have to see the intersection between the values and principles as a composite value system. And you see in the center of the slide, the founding values: human dignity, equality, human rights and freedom, non-racialism, the supremacy of the Constitution, etc. Now, these values and principles, they don't exist in isolation. They don't just, nobody decided to just put them there in Section 185. They're intricately linked to the fundamental rights in our Constitution. So the right of access to information, which is included in Section 32 of our Constitution, is linked to the principle of transparency in Section 195. The right to dignity and the right to equality is linked to the standard of high professional ethics and the principle of the provision of services fairly, equitably, and without bias. The value of the rule of law and the right to just administrative action is linked to the principle of accountability. So when you see these Section 195 and you see this value system that we need to embrace, remember that you are not just looking at Section 195. You're actually looking at the fundamental rights in the Bill of Rights. Transparency, dignity, equality, rule of law, just administrative action. And so what does that tell you? I was told once, I must confess, well, I'm 10 years old in the public service now. I formally started in the public service in 2014, so I'm almost 10 years old. And I come from a human rights background. And I was told a few times, I must be honest, within the public, by public servants, that I don't belong in the public service because I'm a human rights activist and I must go back to where I came from. And my response to these people who told me this is that every public servant should be a human rights activist. The mere peremptory adherence to the constitutional values and principles that forms an indelible part of our value system as public service, that is intricately linked to the Bill of Rights, means by extension and by implication that we ought all to be human rights activists. And our core of our Constitution is built around the Bill of Rights. We cannot move away from that. This slide is just a representation of, again, the link between the values and principles and the Bhataperi principles. But I think that it's important for you to also understand that there's a lot of focus on the Bhataperi. But we also must realize that Bhataperi is a policy statement or policy document. The values and principles is legislated in the Constitution. That is our value system. And so we need to place a lot more importance on the values and principles than we place on the Bhataperi principles. But we need to understand the values and principles, its genesis, the reason why they're there, the intersection between the values and principles, and not to see them in isolation from one another. And as I indicate there, the values and principles, they indicate the type of public administration that we need to aspire as championed in the Constitution. It is about good governance. It is about public servant leadership. And when I speak about public servant leadership, I'm not speaking about your HOD, your DG, your DDG, your chief director. I'm speaking about you in whatever capacity you're in as a public servant leader. Because whether you're a DDG, whether you're an HOD, or whether you're a minister or an MEC, you have to embrace the value system. And it applies to all of us. And fundamentally, as I said, it speaks to one, good governance. The actualization and orientation of the values and principles is all about good governance. And two, it is about public servant leadership. It's teaching us, it's showing us how we need to behave. Some of you listening to me, or all of you listening to me, may be part of one or other religion, where you go to church, to the mosque, to the temple, to the synagogue. And when you go, it's all about how you need to be. There's a value system there that you embrace. And so the values and principles, the constitutional values and principles, are not that dissimilar. This is the value system that is for us as public servants. It doesn't derogate from any of our value systems at home. These are basic values and principles. As I conclude, I spoke earlier on about paradigm change. One of the things that has always bothered me, and this comes from new public management, is that within the discourse of the public service, we often speak about clients and less about the citizens. And it's problematic for me because when you look at it, the Constitution, and think about the Constitution and the fundamental rights in the Constitution and the values and principles, by speaking about clients, we commodifying the inalienable rights of the citizens of our country. If it's a client or a customer, generally speaking, you have options, do you not? So you have an option to go to Pick and Pay, to Woolworths, to Checkers, to ShopRite. If you go to Woolworths and you get bad service at Woolworths, you will say, okay, forget Woolworths, I'll go to Pick and Pay. You always have that option. You have a problem with the insurance company, well, you say, well, don't worry. As a client, I have a choice. So I will change my insurance company. But often, as a citizen, you don't have that choice. If you want an ID, if you want a passport, if you want a marriage certificate, you have to go to the Department of Home Affairs. You don't have a choice. The Constitution speaks about the right to identity as a civil and political right. And so you cannot treat that person at the Department of Home Affairs as a client, as a customer. It is a citizen who has inalienable rights. And so we need to shift that paradigm. We need to move away from this, like I said, this compliance rule-based system, but also change the paradigm of the public sector to start thinking about our people as citizens with particular rights that require services from government, especially in the context when we have such high levels of unemployment and poverty in our country. We can no longer sit here and try to put plasters on a very, very big wound, because that's not the purpose of development orientation in the Constitution. The purpose of development orientation is about development freedom, is about capability improvement. And so I would like you guys, if you haven't fallen asleep yet, I would like you to leave with considering that you should start becoming a vocal advocate of the constitutional values and principles. And if we don't see something, if we see something that is not right within our public sector, we need to call it out. We cannot acquiesce to things or actions that are contrary to the constitutional values and principles. Because in part, that has led us to where we are now. That many of us have been silent when we have seen things that have taken place within the public sector that does not accord with the constitutional values and principles. And in final point that I want to make is that quotation at the bottom. If we are not entitled to the benefits and the blessings of freedom unless we are vigilant in its preservation. And so we need to start becoming vocal advocates. And when we get to the process of implementation of the professionalization framework, which is we developing the action plans for the professionalization framework, we need to embrace that character formation. Without that character formation, the whole professionalization process in the public service will not take root. Colleagues, I thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Yes, just a few housekeeping. Can we all ask our questions on the chat so that our panelists can take their questions at the end of the presentations? Because now we are going to take the next presentation by Ms. Morocco Mabua, also from the Public Service Commission. Over to you, ma'am.
No, Ntate Moses, Mr. Jacobs covered both aspects that needed to be covered, both constitutional values and principles as well as professionalization. I was gonna request for if there's any questions so that Mr. Jacobs can answer them, and I can also answer them where I can before he goes. That's what I was gonna say.
Okay. In that regard, I don't see any questions on the chat, on the Q&A. Colleagues, can we type our questions on the Q&A so that our panelists can attend to them? We will give just a few minutes for questions because currently I don't see any questions. Colleagues, also because I see we are not so many in the webinar, I will also allow colleagues, give colleagues permission to talk. I've got one question that has been loaded. How does the framework address the specific cultural, historical, and socio-economic context unique to South Africa? That is from Dr. Mataiwa Buiseka. And he also asked, what are the key competencies and standards identified in the South African professionalization framework for individuals within the profession? He also asked, how does the framework advocate for continuous professional development and learning for South African professionals? The last question is, how does the South African professionalization framework integrate ethical considerations and responsibilities unique to the South African context? Those are the questions that we have from Dr. Mataiwa Buiseka. Can we entertain them at this point while we are waiting for other colleagues to ask their questions? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you just give me the first question again, please, if you don't mind? I missed the first question.
How does the framework address the specific cultural, historical, and socioeconomic context unique to South Africans? Sorry. You can also see them if you go on Q&A, you will be able to see those questions as well.
Thank you. I don't necessarily see them. I've got the Q&A on. Okay, let me just see the Q&A here. Okay, how does the framework address the specific culture? Okay. So let me put it this way, in terms of the framework itself. The framework is what exactly it actually is. It's a broad framework document that has outlined what the particular challenges are within the public sector, within public administration reform, within values versus rules-driven public service, or rules-driven versus values-driven public service. The political administrative interface, the conflation of public administration and public service, lessons from other developing countries, and there's a statement of intent within the professionalization framework. And as I indicated, that the focus is on those 5 pillars of recruitment and selection, induction and onboarding, etc. The complication and the difficulty is how do you implement and develop action plans to the professionalization framework, which is where we are now. And so one of the real elephants in the room is, if the framework is speaking about the public sector, or even if it speaks about the public service, we do not have at this point a single public service. A public service, in terms of the Public Service Act, is defined in terms of in terms of national and provincial government, and then excludes local government. And so we definitely need to look at legislative and policy alignment. But the framework also, when you speak about sort of cultural, historic, and socioeconomic context, and that is one of the reasons why I painted the picture at the very beginning about public sector reform, what happened in 1994, and the kind of mixed approaches that we have. Because we definitely need to take the specific cultural, historical, and socioeconomic context into account. And so where we are now in terms of trying to develop an action plan, the Public Service Commission held a stakeholder retreat in July 2023, just with key stakeholders now. to thrash out and develop consensus about how to implement the framework. And emerge from that are two governance structures, a steering committee and a technical working group. And it's the work of the technical working group that's going to take a look at the various work streams of these 5 pillars and develop particular action plans for each public service, for each for each pillar. And it's envisaged at this point that we will do a pilot study within human resources sector of the public service as a pilot study and see sort of what we get out of that. But there's also a strong element within the professionalization framework as well that deals with partnerships and collaboration with institutions of higher learning. So we want to create a synergy between what somebody learns if someone is interested in public policy, public administration, what somebody learns at an institution of higher education, and what actually happens within the public service. We need to narrow that gap. But we're also talking about registration with public bodies. I mean, not public bodies, with professional bodies. So in terms of supply chain, there should be a professional body for supply chain, like there's a professional body for lawyers or professional body for engineers. For people to form part of these professional bodies, which will assist with the sort of standards that is required of that particular profession, and a particular code of conduct. So when there is unethical behavior, if there is unprofessional conduct, it's not just only within the public service, but it's also linked to the professional body. Continuous professional development and learning for South African professionals. I mean, that, again, you know, I can't necessarily speak about it in sort of actual terms now. All that I can say is that we, again, developing particular action plans around continuous professional development and learning through the National School of Government, through the policy of revolving doors, so that public servants understand the broader public servant and not just the particular department that they're in. But these must be particularly structured and systematic programs. And that's why we have to look at the organization form of government. So as I'm speaking now, you can hear that the professionalization framework itself is huge, it's massive. It's not something that can be implemented over a financial year. There needs to be careful planning around the action plans, around those 5 pillars, so that there is in fact synergy between all 5 of them. And as you also know, within our own country, we're very good at drafting very good policy documents, but very poor at implementation. And so this is a work in progress, but it's also something that we need to not necessarily be patient about, but be very judicious and diligent about, because it, you know, if we don't implement it properly, it will have a ripple effect. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Jacobs. Let me see, there's a follow-up there by Dr. Biseka again. How does the professionalization framework plan to evolve and adapt its strategies in response to emerging forms of patterns of corruption in the profession? Mr. Jacobs, let's remember to just put on our camera when we are speaking for the purposes of our YouTube viewers. Thanks. Please unmute, Mr. Jacobs.
Oh, I'm having a conversation with myself. I apologize. I was saying that there's a lot of things that are happening behind the scenes. in terms of some of the broader aspects of sort of the professionalization, and not just necessarily I mean, corruption, obviously, and unethical conduct within the professionalization framework was one of the major categories and themes as well. So, but behind the scenes, so if you think again, let's just deal with the organization, the organization and form of government. And let me deal a little bit with the National Prosecuting Authority and the Investigating Directorate as sort of the prosecutorial arm of government. It would be very difficult in the context of state capture, be very difficult for the National Prosecuting Authority and the Investigating Directorate that is specifically tasked to deal with matters of state capture to do its work properly if it's not organized and it doesn't have the institutional capability. So you're going to have to start there. You must understand that when the matters go to court, especially these matters of state capture, the National Prosecuting Authority are coming up against senior SOLs, persons that have extensive experience as defense lawyers and defense advocates. And I think that if you look at the New Lane matter, that was sort of a seminal matter of the National Prosecuting Authority, and that matter was dismissed by court. And I don't think it's going to succeed on appeal. Part of the problem, just in terms of how that matter was argued by the National Prosecuting Authority, is because they were not adequately prepared. And so you do need to firstly look at how you structure, how you organize a particular government entity. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, where Morocco sits in the integrity and anti-corruption part of the Public Service Commission, is that just in terms of whistleblowing itself, the Public Service Commission is working quite closely with the Department of Justice and other parties around tightening legislation to protect whistleblowers. The constitutional values and principles that I say to you is preeminent. If we don't change cultural behavior, if we don't change conduct, if we all stay silent when we see things happening within the public sector, we're never going to get rid of corruption. Forget about the emerging patterns of corruption. I had a conversation with a colleague last night, and he spoke about maladministration. And I said to him, and the Constitution, that perhaps the Constitution should have been more directive. And I say to him, it's not about that. It's about the lack of enforcement. It's about the lack of fortitude to do what is right. And so a lot hinges, even if we deal with recruitment, selection, induction, and onboarding, etc. But a lot hinges on our own particular conduct as public servants individually and public service as a whole. Because we can correct certain things, but if you don't correct behavior, then you're always going to find these forms and new forms and different forms of unethical conduct and corruption emerging within the public service as a whole. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Jacobs. Colleagues, we are still open for questions. I've allowed everyone to speak as well. So if you are able to raise your hand, you can raise your hand and pose your question. Otherwise, if there are no more questions, I will take it that we have come to the end of our webinar. Then we can then adjourn the meeting. Ms. Morocco, Yabua, do you have something to say? I see a hand from, is it Samora? You can come in. And Mamelo after that. Let's open our videos for our YouTube. From Mamelo as well. All right, let's shoot colleagues.
Yeah, Chair, am I audible enough?
You are audible.
Thank you very much, Chair. Firstly, let me commend the gentleman on the presentation. I think it was very eye-opening and straightforward. And I like the frankness of the presentation. That said, Chair, I want to pose this question to the gentleman. What I want to establish, why is the Public Service Commission very, I repeat, very 3 times. Why are they so very submissive to allow the public service to have employees working on contract even for more than 8 to 10 years? And they continuously on a year in, year out basis visit departments, make some sort of introspections in departments. But when it came to this issue of contract workers, it's just a papering over a crack. And it's continuing, and it's a cycle, it's continuing, it's a cycle. At no stage do they develop teeth to ensure that they assert their authority when they come back. And some of these things have not been done. But instead, it will be like, no, it's just a comment. You see, their reports are treated like the ones of the Auditor General. And that is why we will always sit with this cancer. If it is not corruption, then you have this unnecessary thing of further encouraging the low morale of workers in the public service. So I want to know, given the fact that he was so articulative with the constitutional principles and responsibilities of the commission as well as the public service workers, now why are they so very tolerant on this aspect of allowing contract workers in departments to even exceed a period of, for me, 2 years is even too much. But they will allow the issue of contract workers to continue even for 8 to 10 years. And it's very painful because here we talk about breadwinners who can't plan because they are on contract, they don't know what will happen tomorrow. And then their future is stagnant. Thank you very much, Chair.
Okay, thanks for the question. I propose that we take the questions and then they can be responded to after. Mr. Fuela, you had your hand up for a long time, and then it's Mamilo must come in first, and then Mr. Fuela, and then I see Dr. Maitawa has got the hand up as well. Let's take it in that order.
Thank you, Program Director.
Remember to open your video, please, because we are on YouTube as well.
Okay, I'm trying, but there's a challenge there. May I just continue with my question, Chair?
Continue.
Last week at the launch, we had the energy presenting on the professionalization framework. And the mention of the year 2025, I guess it relates to the work that Mr. Cameron says needs to come into effect, given the 2 structures that have been put in place. But what we picked up from that presentation is that emphasis is mainly or much on senior management and executive leadership, and not so much on what we at the coal face have to do to try and get on board as speedily as possible. And I'm saying this because one of the the issues that is being, or the elements that is reflected is accountability. And whilst the framework speaks much of getting ready for employment, as well as the competencies, we don't get to hear much of what needs to be done to do away with what one could call undeterred levels of impunity that we see happening in the public service. I'm not sure what is the comment from Mr. Cameron in terms of what is the framework yet to help us in that regard. Thank you, Chair.
Just a minute. Yes, the next one can continue. Hi, Doctor.
Moses, is it me? I'm not sure. Is it me or somebody else? Hello, Moses?
Doctor, please continue.
All right, thank you very much. Moses, I don't see the icon for the video, so I can't do anything here where I am. So I don't see.
Yeah, let's continue, Doctor.
All right, thank you. Look, I appreciate the presentation. It was comprehensive, and I think it was well, it resonates with the kind of changes that we need to bring about. I know that the public service all over the world has a central role to play in building state capability. It has some of the roles that revolve around establishment of ethical standards, training and sensitization, monitoring and oversight, whistleblower protection, investigation, sanctions, and even in the area of meritocracy, which is very key and important here, which also one would want to know whether we are borrowing from countries like Singapore, Egypt, which have a meritocracy-proof framework to ensure that there's no interference. There you have transparent recruitment processes, performance evaluation, continuous training and development, promotion based on merit, feedback mechanism, review and reform. Now, in essence, the Public Service Commission should play both a proactive and reactive role. So proactive, it sets standards, provide, essentially provide training and promotes meritocracy, and reactively it investigates, reports on unethical behavior, takes corrective action, and ensures that meritocracy or meritocratic principles are consistently applied. So the ultimate goal should be in this domain is to ensure that public administration is both ethical, efficient, serving the public interest in the best possible manner. I want to ask Mr. Jacobs, the presenter, within this framework that I've just outlined, are you satisfied you have played your role effectively? And if you haven't, where have you failed, and what could be the reason why you haven't been able to achieve this optimal performance? Thank you.
Doctor, after you is Jimmy. You can go ahead, Jimmy, Mr. Jimmy Fuela.
Hello.
Okay.
Oh, yes, I was trying to check if you audible that side, but anyway, the issue that I wanted to raise with Mr. Jacobs there, it's when it comes to professionalizing the public service as a whole, I see that in terms of the sectors, there are public servants who are uniformed, and then, but in other sectors, it looks like the issue of uniform is not really an issue. So I don't know if, in a way of trying to professionalize, can we go as far as looking at the issue of how public service as a whole present themselves in terms of dress code? Thank you.
Okay, so this was the round, the last round of questions. So I'm going to open it again now to say, if there's anyone with a question, please pose it now, because after Mr. Jacob's response, we won't be taking any further questions. So can I see by show of hands if there's anyone who still wants to ask? Otherwise, you could drop it on the question and answer there. You can still entertain it. But once Mr. Jacob starts, that will be the end of the Q&A. Thanks, Mr. Jacobs. You can continue. Doesn't look like there's any more hands.
Thank you. So it certainly seems by the questions that have been raised, and I thank you for the questions, that, you know, as a public service, we're in good stead, because these questions are not easy to answer. And I thank you for those questions. And I'm not going to answer them necessarily in chronological order. Let me start by saying, by looking at the role of the Public Service Commission and why, or the question around, you know, the submissive role of the PSC. So there is a historical context to this, I'm afraid. So the public service and part of this historical context, and I think part of the culpability, if you will, must also reside with the Public Service Commission. I must be honest in respect of that. So the historical nature of the Public Service Commission in South Africa is that the Public Service Commission's forerunner was, I think it was the Council of Public Administration during the apartheid era. And it was an incredibly powerful institution that controlled, that was effectively the apartheid, was an apartheid appendage, obviously, but it controlled recruitment and selection, discipline, performance management, everything related to the human resources of the public service during the apartheid state. Excuse me. But when we became a democracy in 1994, there was this need for us to ensure representativity, to ensure that the democratic project continues, and that there are individuals within the public service that believe and will affirm the democratic project. So we needed transformation, and we needed representativity. And so the Public Service Commission was established that took a lot of powers away from its forerunner, right? So when you look at the role of the Public Service Commission now compared to the role of public service commissions elsewhere, the Public Service Commission is a lot more limited. And this is an interesting question as well, because during the ministerial task team and during discussions before the ministerial task team around professionalization, there was intense debate about strengthening the role of the Public Service Commission and how that role can be strengthened. Within that context, the Public Service Commission over the past 2-3 years has been going through a process of what one would call repositioning. And through that repositioning process, it has developed a draft Public Service Commission bill that if it's adopted by the legislature, will repeal the old Public Service Commission bill. And quite interestingly, the cabinet approved the Public Service Commission bill to move now to the next step of getting to the legislature. And so the Public Service Commission has not has not sort of implemented the full extent of its mandate. And part of that problem actually resides within the Public Service Act itself, that has restricted the public service to the provincial and national government. And in respect of that particular piece of legislation, somehow the Public Service Commission was limited to provincial and national government. But when you look at the Constitution, it's somewhat different. The Public Service Commission has, in terms of Section 186(2), has a particular obligation in terms of the maintenance of and effectiveness of the entire public administration, which is inclusive of local government. And if you read it in context of Section 33 of the Constitution of public administration action, may also have a role in terms of functionaries within state-owned entities that perform a public administration function. And so the purpose of the Public Service Commission bill is to strengthen the independence of the Public Service Commission, but also to reinforce its mandate as per the Constitution. And so there needs to be, again, like I said to you before, that synergy between various pieces of legislation so that the full mandate and obligations of the Public Service Commission are articulated as per and performed as per the Constitution. So if to answer your question, have we played our role effectively over the past 30 years? I don't think so. I'll be honest, I don't think so. There are particular reasons for that, but it's also some of the reasons are around limitation of resources and capacity, etc. But other reasons also is that it has not strategically positioned itself as a proper and effective oversight body. And this was pointed out by the Zondo Commission as well when you looked at not only the Public Service Commission, but chapter bodies in general. In terms of the question around the submissive low role by the Public Service Commission, you know, if there's a matter like that about sort of contract extension of particular workers, and I don't know the context, but I think that it's important that the Public Service Commission is made aware of this. And remember, the Public Service Commission is a body that consists of just, I don't know what, just over about 270 odd employees that must have an oversight role of 1.2 million public servants and the provincial and national departments for now. So I would encourage, who was it? I would encourage Samora to actually alert the Public Service Commission to this, and then maybe we can just investigate it further. We have made incredible strides, and I think part of the issue also with the Public Service Commission is that, you know, sometimes our role may be seen as submissive, but we have often engaged with the DPSA in particular, and regulations have been changed, and the Public Service Act has been changed, and policies have been changed as a result of the research and the work of the Public Service Commission. So yes, to a certain extent, there is that level of submission, but at the same time, there's a lot of work that has been done behind the scenes that people don't necessarily know. But please alert us to that particular issue by getting in contact with the Public Service Commission. If it's a grievance, you can contact our legal, labor and management practices branch, or if it's an issue of the public administration, you can contact our integrity and anti-corruption branch. Mamela's question is a very complicated one, and I hear what she is saying. And I think I share to a certain extent, Mamela, the sort of frustration that you have. When I made a presentation at our retreat around the professionalization framework, I spoke about sort of one of the ironies of the professionalization framework is that we are asked or the document says that the public service or the public sector is not professionalized. But the very same persons that, or institutions where the finger is pointed, is also asked to professionalize the public service. And the challenge that we face now in terms of this framework is that it was developed by or drafted initially by the National School of Government. And then there was this broad stakeholder process that included civil society and included local government and included professional high institutions of higher learning as part of the ministerial task team. And it includes the DPSA as well, obviously, and the Public Service Commission. But we also live in this era in the public sector of being compliance driven, right? And so you have all of these stakeholders that, if you look at the professionalization framework as a whole, that have particular responsibilities. So the NSG has a responsibility, the DPSA has a responsibility, the National Planning Commission has a responsibility, the DPME has a responsibility. And we're not operating as a cohesive unit, which is why the Public Service Commission has taken the role of coordinating the implementation of the professionalization framework, and which is why, again, those governance structures of the steering committee and the technical working group become so important. Because even though in terms of the presentation by NSG, there may have been that focus on senior management and executive leadership, that is not where we're going. As I indicated to you, that in terms of the technical working group, we're looking at those particular work streams attached to the 5 pillars. And there will be dedicated individuals to those work streams. And we need to know where to start and where to end, right? Because it has to be a systematic process. But that work has just begun in respect of setting up this technical working group and these particular work streams. But you're right, it's not at the level of senior management and executive leadership, and maybe NSG is focused on that, but I can certainly tell you from my side and from the Public Service Commission side, we are not focused on that. And I do implore upon you to perhaps just be a little bit patient in respect of your question about sort of how do we, deter these sort of levels of impunity as we go along the process of developing this work streams and develop particular action plans to be implemented in respect of the work streams. I hope that there's going to be that multiplier effect, that's going to actually result in just increased level of awareness, increased actualization and internalization, besides sort of the hard work of, around recruitment and selection, right? There is also sort of the whole process of looking at entrance exams or entry exams. There's a whole process of looking at an integrity framework. So if you were to apply for a job, for example, at SIU, part of the application process is this whole long document where they ask you particular questions that they will then evaluate. And that is part of their own process of recruitment in terms of sort of integrity management. And so within that entire process as well, we're looking at developing an integrity framework so that when we start the process of recruitment and selection, we have a similar framework to the SIU, so that you can start screening individuals that may not necessarily be fit for the public service itself. Because once you get somebody in the public service, they may not necessarily be fit for purpose, as you know, and all of us know, it's really difficult through a performance management system as we currently have, to get that person extricated from the public service is incredibly difficult. The question around uniforms. It's a very good question, actually. It's not a question necessarily about uniforms, but it is a question about how we present ourselves. And when I started in a previous life when I started work outside of the public sector, I was informed that, you know, you wear a shirt and a tie. When I look at the public service, I look at people at the public service, I don't see that uniform dress code that is smart and elegant, that exudes confidence, that exudes authority. And I think that you're absolutely right. You know, part of professionalization is about our conduct. And part of our conduct is how we dress. And it's something that I will certainly take through to the technical working group, just around establishing perhaps guidelines, if you will, about codes of about dress code. And of course, the critical part of that would be how that is enforced within the public service itself, that we don't turn a blind eye to it. But I think it's an incredibly important point, excuse me, that you make, that we don't necessarily need to have a uniform that typifies us as the public service, but we certainly need to have a dress code that is befitting of public service, so that we take ourselves seriously and the citizens out there know that we take them seriously. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Jacobs. Colleagues, as indicated, that was the last of our questions and the last response from Mr. Jacobs. Are there any other comments that we might want to make, Ms. Mohammed and Ms. Mabua? Are there any last comments you want to make?
Thank you, Dr. Moses. From my side, nothing really much except to thank the colleagues for being in attendance. But I just want to reiterate, you know, the values, the constitutional values and principles, you know, to remind ourselves that as public servants, as we serve, we must continuously remember that we need to align ourselves with the constitutional values and principles as they give us direction on how we do business, how we conduct ourselves as public servants, how we are supposed to make decisions as public servants, how we treat each other, you know, as public servants, that we need to create an enabling environment that enables our fellow, you know, colleagues to be the best that they can be within the work environment. And also how we as public service treat members of the public as our clients, you know, and other government departments. My colleague Cameron, you know, made an example. If you're not happy with outsurance, you can go to Auto and General in terms of insurance. But Home Affairs, there's no other institution that is mandated to perform those kind of functions. So let's remind ourselves that as public servants, we need to serve wholeheartedly. As a public servant, you are appointed to serve. Being of service takes priority, you know, higher than your own personal interests. And therefore, we have to live as in LIVE, live and demonstrate, you know, demonstrate these constitutional values, because they are a guiding principle. You know, there's a saying that unless you stand for something, you'll fall for anything that comes your way. These constitutional values and principles are what we should stand for as public servants. You know, I like to use an analogy of a suit, you know, a suit as in, you know, this outfit that you wear. You know, these constitutional values and principles, it's this suit that is this size, you have to fit in it. It cannot be expanded, you know, to accommodate you. In other words, as public sector, it's not negotiable that, you know, maybe you can, you know, leave the constitutional values, maybe you've got an option not to. No. Consistently, we've got to comply and lead institutional values and principles, because as I said, they are a guiding light that illuminates our path to a brighter future. With those words, colleagues, I'd like to thank you, and hopefully we will meet again. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, ma'am. Yes, Ms. Mohammed, would you like to say something about the Public Service Month? It doesn't look like Ms. Mohammed is still with us. Mamelo? Yeah, no, I just wanted Ms. Mohammed maybe just to indicate that this is happening in the context of the Public Service Month, and we have a string of other webinars that are lined up for the month, and then this was just one of them. So we will be sending out invites to other webinars, and then we really welcome your attendance to this Public Service Month events. Colleagues, if there's nothing else that we have to deal with, I would like to thank all of you for attending. Thank the panelists for this detailed presentation, and wish you a good day going forward. Thank you, colleagues. The webinar is adjourned.
Thank you.